In fact, that may have been what 21-year-old University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee student Nathan Potter thought when he was attacked and killed while walking home to his apartment nearby. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Potter's killer, 18-year-old Shondell Jackson, had zero sorrow and no regret over his crimes, as shown by his disturbing lack of empathy or remorse during the trial in court. Jackson maintained this evil grin throughout court sessions, revealing himself to be a heartless, stone-cold killer. At one point, he was escorted out of the courtroom. Jackson taunted the victim's family by smiling. If you found that gesture utterly distasteful, Judge Rebecca Dallett did too. That is why she sentenced Jackson to a much-deserved life term in prison, with no chance of parole. If he hadn't seen it coming, Jackson became enraged. He cursed out at the judge and grew violent to the point where court police had to move in and subdue him. And while Jackson's reaction was intense, members of his family had this to say to the victim's family after learning that the judge had imposed the maximum sentence.
When I saw it on the news, I even cried. I'm like, oh my God, I can't imagine what that mother is going through.
How much must the Potter family suffer at the hands of the Jackson family, you wonder? Thomas T.J. Michael Lane. T.J. Lane fits the bill for a cold-blooded killer. The 17-year-old walked into the cafeteria at Chardon High School and opened fire, killing 3 students and gravely wounding 3 others. Lane was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 count of assault following this horrifying incident. In court, Lane showed no signs of remorse despite the chilling nature of his crimes. He smiled and smirked and rolled his eyes, leading the prosecutor to label him an evil person. Just when you thought Lane couldn't sink any lower, this is how serious he felt about the pain of the victims' families as they read their impact statements in court. And what he said when he called to address the court will leave you stunned. On the day of his sentencing, Lane sneaked a white t-shirt in court that had the word killer scrawled across the chest. The same disturbing word was written on the shirt he wore on the day of the shooting, highlighting just what a sadistic teen criminal he was. On March 19, 2013, Lane was eventually sentenced to 3 life sentences with no chance of parole, escaping the death penalty only because he was a juvenile at the time of the incident. Less than a year later, T.J. Lane made headlines yet again when he attempted a prison break, news that set off alarms in Chardon. But he was soon recaptured some 100 yards outside of the prison fence. But what a nightmare that would have been. The horror of these 2 teens did to their grandma rocked a peaceful city in Wisconsin and shocked the entire nation. Antonia Barbeau and Nathan Pape. 78-year-old Barbara Olson was attacked and brutally murdered by her very own great-grandson, 13-year-old Antonia Barbeau, assisted by his best friend, 14-year-old Nathan Pape. Barbeau and Pape hacked and bludgeoned the helpless 78-year-old to death with a hatchet and hammer. A measly $150 was all they could steal from the elderly victim they had just brutally slaughtered. It was a murder that left the tiny community in Sheboygan County in disbelief and fear. But it's what the killers did after the murder that turned people's guts. Later that day, the 2 teen criminals went bowling and used their pitiful loot to buy themselves marijuana and some pizza. It wouldn't be until 2 days later that Barbara's body would be found and the 2 boys apprehended for her murder. Given the brutal and disturbing nature of their crime, prosecution determined to try both Barbeau and Pape as adults on first-degree intentional homicide charge. In the legal proceeding, the boys appeared genuinely remorseful for their mindless crime and freely volunteered the grim details of what was Antonio Barbeau's great-grand's horrifying last moments. On the day of sentencing, Barbeau cried, but despite this tearful gesture, both teens were sentenced to life terms in prison, with parole eligibility in the year 2047 for Antonia Barbeau and 2042 for Nathan Pape. Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero. called to the 45-year-old Daniel Halseth's northwest Las Vegas home after his burnt and dismembered body, stabbed and cut 70 times, was found in his garage. Even more shocking was the revelation of who the murder was perpetrated by: Halseth's very own 16-year-old daughter, Sierra Halseth, together with 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero, who was her boyfriend at the time. Grisly details of Daniel Halseth's murder notwithstanding, it was perhaps this video showing the couple's lack of remorse that made this case most famous.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. After murdering day 3 after murdering somebody.
Whoa! Don't put that on the camera.
Where it was all smiles before their arrest and trial. In court, the gravity and utter brutality of the savage crime forced a mood and tone altogether. Sierra remained speechless, expressionless, and emotionless throughout the proceedings, revealing the purported chilling and disturbing relationship she had with her father. Sierra's family denied allegations claiming that Daniel physically and sexually abused his daughter, and several members of her family even suggested the death penalty for the murderous teens. The couple pleaded guilty to all charges against them, including murder with a deadly weapon, robbery with a deadly weapon, fraudulent use of a credit card or debit card, and arson. Both Sierra and Guerrero were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Up next, the disturbing case of a troubled 15-year-old girl charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action reveals how a troubled upbringing and childhood psychological issues reveal the complexities and devastating consequences of juvenile criminal behavior. Alyssa Bustamante. 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante lured her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olton, into the woods before slitting her throat and stabbing her to death. Worse still, after attempts to burn the body failed, Bustamante went and buried Olton's lifeless body in a pre-dug grave, demonstrating premeditation of the senseless murder, and it was Bustamante herself who led police to the hole she had dug the week prior, being the grave where she buried her brutally slain victim. Bustamante was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action following the death of Elizabeth Olton. She first appeared in court on November 17, 2009, where she pleaded not guilty despite her confession. However, Bustamante pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder in exchange to avoid trial and possibly the life sentence without parole. Bustamante was a troubled girl with a troubled upbringing who acted out her dark desires upon her innocent 9-year-old neighbor, and she tried to show how much she regretted her actions when she made her statement during her sentencing hearing. The judge, however, was not moved by her remorse, handing her a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 35 years, making her earliest possible release in 2054, when she will be 60 years old. And just when you thought you've seen it all, another kid criminal proves himself to be the epitome of evil. This kid was convicted on a charge of first-degree murder with premeditation and extreme atrocity. Matthew Borges. On November 2016, Matthew Borges had reportedly gone to smoke marijuana with his classmate, 16-year-old Lee Manuel Vilora Paulino. That was the last time Paulino would be seen alive. 2 weeks later, a dog walker stumbles upon a body along the banks of Merrimack River. That body belonged to Paulino, stabbed to death and decapitated. Borges was not initially the suspect, but when all the evidence and witness accounts started pointing irrefutably in his direction, the detectives looked no farther. Given the nature of the crime, the judge ruled that Borges would be tried as an adult on the charges of first-degree murder, which meant that Borges was looking at a life sentence without the possibility of parole if convicted. Borges, who was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, was, for the most part, unbothered and remained stoic and expressionless, even when his sentence was being handed down. Eventually, Borges was sentenced to life imprisonment, but a parole clause had to be added because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, despite having been tried as an adult. While 15-year-old Borges will be eligible for parole after serving 30 years in prison, crime history pages list the next juvenile offender as the youngest person in the United States to be sentenced to life in prison, without the chance of parole. He was 12 years old. Who is he? Where is he now? And what horrible crime did he commit? Let's go back to where it began. Lionel Alexander Tate. 12-year-old Lionel Tate was playing wrestling with his 6-year-old neighbor, Tiffany Unick, when, according to Tate, she stopped breathing. Unfortunately, Tiffany died before she could be seen by the doctors. Even more shocking were the disturbing details on her autopsy report. The poor girl had suffered a badly fractured skull, broken ribs, and more than 30 internal injuries, including a lacerated liver. When asked, Tate claimed that he was only imitating pro wrestling moves he had seen on TV when he accidentally injured the girl, adding that he did not intend to kill his friend. Following the tragic incident, Tate was charged with murder in the first degree and would be tried as an adult, which, according to Florida law, meant that he was facing life imprisonment with no chance of parole if convicted. Tate's emotional state during the trial suggested genuine remorse and sorrow for his reckless actions, leading to the death of his friend. Tate was in tears throughout his sentence hearing, where the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. He was only 14 years old at the time. That is not where this story ends. Tate's sentence sparked nationwide debate as to whether the sentence was too harsh. Many, including the lawyers who prosecuted him in court, pleaded for leniency on Tate's behalf. As luck would have it, Tate got his second chance after an appeal court threw out his conviction in 2003. Tate walked out of jail a free man, only to find himself in trouble with the law not long after. In May of 2005, Tate was positively identified as the gunman in an armed robbery case where a pizza man was beaten and robbed at gunpoint. In May of 2006, Tate pleaded guilty to gun possession, which also meant he violated his probation and was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. The judge said to him, "Lionel Tate, you have run out of second chances," before sending him to jail. Tate is expected to be released in January 2031, where he will be 42 years old.